Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week are Maddie Namer, CEO, and Daniel Kahn, VP of Real Estate with Cannabeta. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Excellent. Well, before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter and make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Maddie, I'd like to start with you. No CEO bias or anything there, Daniel, but Maddie, what brought you to cannabis, and what was it that found you where you're at with Cannabeta today?
Yeah. So I've been a drug policy reform advocate for over 2 decades now. Kind of starting off going to the May Day protests in 2001 in New York City, and eventually became a part of Students for Sensible Drug Policy in my college years. I was part of the New Paltz chapter, and then founded the New York University chapter of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And then have been involved with drug policy reform afterwards up until today, still remain involved with that. In parallel, my career has centered around commercial real estate, developing asset management, and brokering transactions for real estate in and around the New York region. And so when New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut all legalized marijuana for recreational use within a very short period of time, it seemed like possibly there was an opportunity to combine two of my lifelong interests, I guess you could say, real estate and drug policy, by helping cannabis companies navigate the new regulations in those states and help them find real estate that would be compliant and they would be able to get licenses for. So we're kind of able to combine our expertise in multiple areas to provide a real specialty service for folks. And as a result, we started the first cannabis-specific real estate brokerage firm on the East Coast, and now operate in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland.
When did you found Cannabeta?
The company is a little over 2 years old now. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of started around the time of legalization, sort of right after the MRTA in New York, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed.
Coming from a drug reform policy background, are you satisfied with where the East Coast is right now?
I think that it's sort of a mixed bag, and my own opinions on the best way to, have a legal marijuana industry have changed, I think, a little bit over time. I think that it's really sort of nice to see this sort of new wave of states that tend to be like more progressive politically states, really focus on trying to repair the harms from the drug war and promote social equity in licensing. Mm-hmm. And we've also seen how there's some things about those attempts that have gone well and other things that have seemingly not gone quite as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think that the states that we operate in most are New York and New Jersey. And I think New Jersey is doing a good job for the most part. I think that they have issued a lot of licenses to businesses that are minority and women owned, and aren't sort of large corporate institutions. They're really trying to make it more of a diverse marketplace, that's not sort of dominated by a few companies. I think that's great. I really believe, both, I guess, as a capitalist and a socialist, that it's great to have a diverse amount of small businesses, in an industry. And then in New York State, I think that they have a really ambitious program to try to really limit licenses to folks right now that have been previously incarcerated. And I think there's a lot of aspects of that program that haven't really been thought through so well.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, we have a bit of an axe to grind, to be quite honest, because what they're doing in New York State, they set up a cannabis real estate fund and then illegally hired one real estate brokerage firm without a bid process to basically source all the real estate for that fund. So, it's a bit of a mixed bag. And kind of excited to see where Maryland goes with their process now that they've just legalized for recreational use as well. And we sort of expect Pennsylvania will be coming down the pike soon as well.
You had said that your beliefs have changed over the years. What were some of the more significant changes?
I think that I am seeing now in New Jersey, especially now with the capital markets really tightening. Cannabis was always a bit of a difficult thing to find financing for, but now, capital is really drawn a lot more towards less risky investments. And so it's a lot harder to finance cannabis projects right now. And I used to believe that really the concept of limiting licenses was really problematic and just sort of almost like a bit of crony capitalism, like sort of, having the state issue these things that are then worth a lot of money because they're artificially limiting them. So I didn't really believe in that concept at first and thought there should be more of a free market with that. But I'm also kind of seeing now how the fact that they are not limiting licenses in New Jersey is making it in some ways probably harder for that industry to get up and running, because these companies, and especially the social equity firms, really having trouble raising money just off the fact that they've won a license, because there's going to be a lot of competition there. So I'm not exactly sure if I definitely believe that states should limit licenses now, but I think if you had to say what I think might be the best approach nowadays, I think that it might be to kind of have a little bit of a limited license structure, especially on the cultivation side of things, and for that to probably be done somewhat through a lotto process.
Gotcha.
Perhaps like a mix of having the right credentials, having the right paperwork, having the right team, and then a lotto process.
Okay. Daniel, as the VP of real estate at Cannabeta, what was your journey to cannabis?
So I had started out my real estate career as an office leasing agent in Manhattan, and have known Maddie for, a couple decades now, through a party scene in New York. And we had found ourselves, at lots of after parties, smoking weed together and hanging out after hours. And so when he decided to open up a cannabis business, and I having a love of cannabis myself, and I am a longtime user, this seemed like a worlds coming together kind of moment. And I jumped on the opportunity to, be involved in something I love with something that I do for a living, which has been it's been a mostly positive experience. Not to say that we don't run into our share of interesting, colorful people that might not be the most professional in cannabis. But I'll be working with a lot of people. I love working with these social equity applicants, especially who are really trying to make something out of this industry. So that's been very fun.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really come together, I think, in a lot of ways for us.
Okay. So, Maddie, how should companies be evaluating buildings when they're looking to put a cannabis business in there?
Yeah, so it's obviously going to be very different depending on what kind of cannabis business.
Mm-hmm.
So, we can start with cultivation
Sure.
there. Um, so we're very active, in particular in New Jersey right now, helping companies source industrial real estate for cultivation. In New Jersey, it's not permitted to grow cannabis on agriculturally zoned land. So um, all of the cultivation is going to have to take place on industrially zoned land. And that land has been growing in terms of market value over the past 5 to 10 years quite dramatically in New Jersey. There's an under 3% vacancy rate for industrial in New Jersey. So it can be a bit challenging to find the right real estate for cultivation there. A lot of our clients are probably a little more focused on finding existing buildings rather than building ground up.
Mm.
And I think there's multiple reasons for that. One of them is that they often think that they'll be able to be up and running faster. And I think that most of our clients are very interested in being able to be one of the first groups to market, because typically what we've seen in other states with cannabis wholesale prices is that they tend to be very high at the beginning of the market, and margins are very high for cultivators, and then that starts to drop over time. So that's one reason. Another reason I think also might be because of just a little bit less access to capital these days. As far as what kinds of existing buildings, um, industrial buildings in New Jersey right now that are good for warehousing really come at quite a premium. So those buildings are going to be near major thoroughfares, near major population centers, and most importantly, will have a lot of loading bays and often like high ceiling heights and ways for trucks to maneuver around those buildings and get in and out of those loading bays with big trucks. So cannabis cultivators don't really need all of that. So that's not something that we often need to try to target for them, which is helpful. One thing that is a real challenge, probably the biggest challenge, is finding buildings that are going to be able to support the electrical and overall power needs for cannabis cultivation facilities. The large majority of properties that we look at don't have that existing infrastructure in place. So it's often a big question around, if our clients were to move into that property, how long and how expensive would it be to get the utility provider to provide the needed power for those facilities. Another thing that I would say is pretty important is ceiling height and insulation. So oftentimes you don't really get a lot of the benefits of being in an existing building if that existing building essentially has no insulation, because then you kind of have to build sort of like a box within a box
Right.
to be able to have your grow rooms be properly insulated. So obviously, folks probably know that it's important to have your grow rooms be very well climate controlled. So in a climate like New Jersey's, where it's very hot in the summertime, very cold in the wintertime, climate control is really important, and therefore insulation is important. It can be expensive to do in an existing building. And one other thing probably would be ceiling heights. Some of the properties that we look at just don't really have good ceiling heights to be able to do a grow properly, to be able to fit the mechanical equipment and the irrigation and all these things in there, and be able to have, tall enough plants. And that can really vary from cultivator to cultivator depending on how they want to design their system. So, folks that want to do dual tiered cannabis cultivation systems are going to need higher ceiling heights. Folks that want to grow really tall plants and sort of produce for volume are going to oftentimes want higher ceiling heights, but also folks that want to grow top shelf premium cannabis, they're often going to want to be able to have space to put in mechanical equipment and irrigation and stuff as well. So ceiling heights is another thing that can sometimes limit us from certain buildings. And then I also think it's important to just keep in mind location. New Jersey is not, a huge state, so it's not terribly hard for somebody to get, to ship cannabis from one side of the state to the other. However, I do think it is also important to keep in mind how easy it is to be able to staff those facilities. And there's like a part in southern New Jersey right now where the real estate is often like the cheapest that it is throughout New Jersey. And there is, availability of industrial sites in those areas. But they're also, in areas where it just might be a little harder to find the staff for those facilities. I'm probably forgetting some things, and I don't know if Dan, you want to add to that list.
Daniel, one thing I was curious about is how much investigation do you have to go into regarding what was previously at the structure, just so there aren't any contaminants or other problems that might need to be remediated before a cultivation could be set up?
Sure. We will certainly generally ask ownership for a phase one environmental, try to make sure there's no asbestos or any glaringly obvious issues. We've come across some old gas station facilities and glass manufacturing that have become something that often comes up in conversation. We end up having that can become a drawn out conversation before you know it, of who's going to be responsible for remediation. So that's certainly something to be aware of and ahead of. Certainly we've seen deals killed because after the fact we found out that there was some environmental hazard.
Okay.
And I'd like to speak a little more towards the power conversation, just to fill that in a little bit, because that is 100% where we run into the most issues in getting deals to the finish line. So it's a multi-tiered conversation, I think. Maddie's absolutely right that, very few buildings have the power need for cultivation, which to give some example to our users, what we've found is the only industry that uses the kind of power that cultivation uses is Bitcoin mining. Oh,
okay.
So just to give a little perspective, we're talking about, a couple thousand amps of power. Your average building that, is listed as heavy power has, 480 volts at 1200 amps. The average cannabis user for 50,000 feet needs 5,000 amps.
Right.
So upgrading power is going to be necessary pretty much no matter where you go. What we're hearing from the power companies is a 12 to 18 month timeline to bring in power. So speaking to Maddie's earlier point, where most of the cultivators are shooting for a speed to market conversation, this 12 to 18 month timeline from the utility provider becomes a real hurdle. So in order to mitigate some of that, what we've been doing is talking to renewable power solutions to create microgrids. which we find is really the answer here. Some combination of solar and usually gas-powered generators. And those can come in small boxes that can be combined to create the kind of power you need. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And the other thing that I think is very important, especially for cannabis, when you go into these conversations, is to make sure that ownership either owns the building outright or is able to refi. We've been, working very hard to make banking relationships for owners. We're working on a deal now where the owner's bank came to him and said, if you put cannabis in here, you're going to have to refi because we won't allow this. We're gonna cut your loan. So that's something that definitely needs to be dealt with on the front end long before you get into drawn out lease negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it sounds like if you're talking about like renewable energy microgrids. First of all, that sounds expensive, but also something that could be quite interesting to a industry that really wants to pride itself on being sustainable. Or in states like New Jersey or markets as they open, does it all just come down to speed to market?
Well, what's nice, a lot of it's speed to market, but what's nice about the microgrid, offsetting the power, and I don't know that the solar is a solution for power, but it's certainly a solution for offsetting power and getting the first phase in quick enough to get your cannabis up. But what's nice from an owner's perspective of the building is that there is a lot of tax incentives to put solar. As Jersey is a great example, they have some of the highest incentives in the country. So there is a huge benefit for a building owner, not the cannabis user, to put the solar in and benefit through the tax incentives. Mm-hmm. Another thing we found out recently is that there are federal grants for agriculture, renewable energy for agriculture, which apparently cannabis falls under the category of agriculture for this purpose. So 50% of that project could conceivably be paid for outright by the government.
Great.
So I think as while that is expensive, I think there is real benefit to going the microgrid solution. Mm-hmm. And I think that down the road, we're going to start seeing some requirement for renewable power over a certain, amperage. So I think it's something to start considering now.
Yeah, just wanted to add in there because you mentioned speed to market and asked if that's the only motivating factor. And I would say that it probably used to be, in particular, before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed last summer, which added, I think the tax credits on buying this equipment went up from 10% to 40%. And so now the economics have really changed. And it does make a lot of sense for companies to put in solar arrays with batteries to offset some of the power needs that you would need from the utility provider, and also to use some of these combined heating and power situations to potentially use natural gas to directly heat and cool the building, so you're not doing that with electricity, which actually, even though you're using natural gas, is overall more sustainable way of doing it, sort of on site, and the metrics sort of end up working out that it does make it a little more sustainable. So yeah, the economics, and there's also a lot of different ways to go about that. You can kind of purchase the equipment yourself and do it outright, but more commonly people are working with firms that will do a contract with you. They'll own all that equipment, they'll install it for you, and then they'll sell you the power as you operate your facility.
And one last point on this, I would say that having a component of gas-powered generators and renewables also gives you some safety of, God forbid, the main power station goes down in your area and you're, not getting grid power for 6 months. You're not losing your crop because you have some power of your own in the building that's not tied into the grid.
Okay. With such a limited inventory out there, how quick do you guys have to be to try and put a client into a new building before it's, either snatched up by somebody else or it's, not available anymore?
I think that's an excellent question. I think, we try to be on top of new listings so that we can let our customers know within, a week of something coming on the market. And we certainly push them knowing that, we're likely going to be competing against non-cannabis users. So it becomes, a very important, speed to market is everything. Getting in front of these owners and letting them know that we're willing to be a little more aggressive than the market to get these deals done is everything.
Okay. What do you look for in terms of regulations and how they vary state to state, just in that eastern corridor that you guys operate?
I think the state to state conversation is almost less important than the township by township conversation.
Okay.
So we're giving the state rules. The state rules are relatively broad, is what I'm seeing. And then they're letting the local zoning and local government kind of refine those rules much further.
Okay.
So while the state rules might allow you 1,000 feet to a school, the local rule might say 1,500 feet to a daycare, school, or college.
Okay.
So it's really, this business it's not enough to understand the state rules. It's really about getting into the weeds on a township level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In Jersey. Go ahead, Maddie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, comparing New York to New Jersey's laws really made it so that the townships have a lot of power. New Jersey didn't set regulations for proximity. So the state regulations don't say that you can't be next to a church or school or anything like that. They just really leave it up to the towns entirely. And some towns don't opt in at all. Some towns opt in and say, you can do a cannabis business, but like only in this one, super contaminated brownfield site that's in like a wet zone that no one would ever do,
Mm-hmm.
So you really get a huge variety there. And then, contrast that with New York State. New York State did set proximity rules in their statewide laws. So they have for dispensaries, proximity, you can't be closer than 500 feet away to a school or closer than 200 feet away to a house of worship. But what New York State also did recently in one of their latest batches of regulations is they prohibited towns from making rules that were too onerous for proximity. So some towns created cannabis zoning laws for medical that they kind of have to dial back now based on the new state regulations. So a town, for instance, can't opt into doing cannabis and then say, all right, you can only do it in this one part of the town. The state is actually preventing that. So you sort of have a lot more township control in New Jersey, and in New York, you sort of have less now.
Okay. When you started this venture, you were tying, your professional lives with a personal passion. Have you found that tie has it worn on you a little bit? Have you found yourselves a little bit disenfranchised with the cannabis industry with kind of the roadblocks that you've hit along the way?
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I would say that I still have a passion for cannabis and helping the industry. That certainly hasn't gone away. I have seen more shady operators than I expected and hoped to run into. Mm-hmm. So that has certainly been something to, work through and past. But that said, we still, certainly have a passion for this and certainly feel strongly that we're, going to be successful in helping people find their ultimate locations.
Okay.
So I think it's made me more careful, but I don't think it's making me, hate the game.
Okay. How about you, Maddie?
Well, I think that since we opened for business, it's been it's been a tough couple of years for the
Mhm.
cannabis industry, I think, generally. So that part has been disappointing, I think, to be honest. You know, I, I if you look at some of the stocks of these MSOs, um, some of them are like almost 14% or something of the value that they used to be like years ago, or less even sometimes. So quite a dramatic drop there. It's been a thing past couple years. Um, I think that the pace of new states opening up seemed to kind of slow down a little bit in the past couple years, so that's part of it. And also, I just think the financing markets have gotten harder. So it's I think in some ways, like, and then also there's issues like in California where you just had this massive issues with oversupply. In New York State, for better or for worse, there's a lot of differing opinions on this, and I sometimes feel differently day to day on this. There's a huge proliferation of gray market operators. I think there was like an estimate recently that there was something like 1,500 or something like retail locations popped up around the state that are unlicensed selling cannabis. Um, and that's a real challenge for the industry, for the legal industry. It honestly is like starting to become kind of a big challenge. I Here in Ithaca, New York, where we are, we have a legal dispensary and then an illegal one a couple doors down. And I just kind of, for research and development purposes,
Yeah.
went and went into the legal dispensary and bought some products. And they're selling eighths of cannabis for 50, $60, something like that. And then a couple doors down, they were selling an ounce for $50.
Right.
At the gray market one. So those kinds of differences are going to mean that the legal industry is going to have a real hard time if there's not some kind of way to essentially, you know, to essentially kind of shut down those businesses somehow. And personally, I'm hopeful that they do that in a non-criminal way,
Yeah.
but still kind of find a way to let it be so that the legal industry can flourish, the social equity people winning these licenses can have successful businesses, the state can get tax revenue. And I think pretty importantly, we in New York can set an example for other states to say, hey, yeah, this is a really good thing. We got tax revenue, we got jobs, and you should do this too in your state. And I think that has been the reason that we're starting to see legalization in more and more states, is because other states can kind of look at other states and say, hey, they did it successfully, they raised all this tax revenue, and eventually that's going to, I believe, how we're going to get to federal legalization, is just with enough states having legalized for recreational use, eventually the federal government's just going to have to do it. So yeah, I think that yeah, it's a mixed bag
Okay.
overall.
Well, I mean, until recently, and I actually heard it from a few people at MJ Biz this year about how New York kind of came out and said that they weren't going to do anything about the gray market or illicit operators in the state. And a lot of people were kind of frustrated with that.
I mean, yeah, I think that they took a really long time. We talked about how it's been over 2 years now since they legalized here. We don't really there's, I think, maybe like four or something open legal dispensaries in the state. Over 2 years later, so there was this long period of time where they really didn't have any means to provide any kind of enforcement or even fines or anything against gray market operators. And as a cannabis user, is like kind of fun. You can like kind of like go to the park and be like, oh, cool, like like everyone's getting high here, and there's like 12 stalls of people like with their own little handmade joints that they're selling and stuff. But truth be told, it's gotten so massive now.
Mm.
You really like any bodega you walk into, you ask them for a joint, they have them behind the counter. I mean, you can just get cannabis anywhere in New York State now.
Mm.
That they're going to have to do something, I think, for the legal industry to be successful in the long run.
Okay.
Because it's just gotten so massive. And I think if they had started the legal program faster after legalization, that it probably would have never like gave that opening for those gray market operators to kind of come in and fill this needed demand.
Daniel, you were talking about you've had to work with some shady operators. When you go to those meetings, how do you determine whether or not you're going to pursue the business? And is it just sometimes you realize this is a partnership that's got to happen until the deal is done?
A lot of time, you do your best to vet people and ask for financials, but in an industry where really people are raising money as you go, it's very hard to know who is ultimately going to be as good as their word.
Mm.
And
Okay.
you have to work with a good number of people that ultimately are not reputable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're getting better at vetting those people and not just believing everything. That certainly took us a little time to just get on the page of we need to vet our customers and not work with everybody.
Mm.
But you want to help people that are trying to accomplish something and are scrappy young entrepreneurs. It's certainly the kind of people that you can't help yourself but want to believe, and want to believe in.
Mm-hmm.
And you just, you kind of play it out a little bit and kind of see where they're at along the way, I think is the best we really can do.
Okay. Mehdi, do you still think the East Coast is a $10 billion opportunity in cannabis, or is it more or less?
Well, I think like the entire East Coast, probably more.
Yeah. Or sorry, just the quarter that I guess, is it on your website? Is it just the states that you operate in? So like New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, that's the $10 billion opportunity?
I think you'd probably say just even in the tri-state region. So like it's often
New York, New Jersey, Connecticut,
New Jersey, and New York. That's an over $10 billion opportunity. And that's kind of like based off of states like Massachusetts, which I think have something like a 6 million person population, and they're doing over $2 billion in revenue. And New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, I think you're maybe like somewhere like 29 million people.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can kind of do your middle school algebra there and sort of figure it out. But yeah, and I think that the things that might make it not so, I think are kind of just what we were talking about. How easy is it for people to obtain product in the gray market, and does it, undercut the legal market substantially? And I think right now it is. It's sort of a combination, I think, of New York being very kind of permissible with the gray market operators, and California having just like a massive oversupply of product. So yeah, I think I think it definitely has that potential. The demand is certainly there. So it's just about how the industry really gets set up for that.
When it comes to social equity licenses, you had previously mentioned that some have gone well, some have not. In your opinion, what's gone well and what hasn't?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that when I like how New Jersey kind of went about it for the most part. they gave priority licensure to um, minority women-owned businesses, to and sort of gave even greater priority to groups that what they called social equity, which was I believe people that were kind of from certain areas of New Jersey and met certain income thresholds. And so they gave priority licenses to those folks. And a lot of those folks were then able to, you know, like start to get dispensary permits from different towns and are starting to open different dispensaries there. And I think that what was successful about that program in a way is that they didn't try to kind of overregulate it. They sort of gave priority licenses out, but it wasn't, they didn't try to completely reinvent the wheel. And they allowed a lot of freedom to how the businesses were going to sort of go and operate. And they really kind of decentralized it in a way, put a lot of power into the townships, which I think was also good. In New York State, they're kind of still figuring it out. They initially created this fund because they recognized that, yes, we can give, folks that are have been disadvantaged in various ways, maybe don't have the same kind of privilege as, the CEOs of these, the white CEOs of these massive MSOs, obviously. But, where were they going to get access to capital? So I think in principle, it was kind of a good idea, but I think what they maybe could have done better about that is to award grants and let those businesses kind of source their own real estate, hire their own teams to build out their spaces, not create these really onerous rules around how close the dispensaries can be to one another. So they recently came out with a rule, which I think they might dial back, that said that dispensaries can't be less than 1,000 feet away from one another, which in Manhattan is like crazy.
Yeah.
That's like, that's like an entire neighborhood in Manhattan, basically. So it's basically saying like, okay, we can have one in all of like Soho and then one in all of Greenwich Village. Like it just doesn't really make sense. So so I think that, giving a little bit more freedom to let the industry develop how it's going to develop is helpful. While still finding ways to give a little bit of a leg up, give a little bit of a head start to some of these like social equity groups, these, groups of people that are really amazing entrepreneurs, but are like, have been underprivileged throughout their lives or have had family members that, or a family that was really negatively impacted by the drug war, served in prison time for possession charges and things, So I think it's great they're trying to, that those folks are trying to, lead the industry now in New York State. But the issue around this fund has been a bit of a mess. And I think that it's delayed the opening of legal businesses in New York State. And I think that they're now starting to kind of realize that they do need to provide more freedom to those groups. We're now starting to have clients that are coming to us that have been awarded what they call conditional adult use retail dispensary licenses, this sort of first wave that went to people that were, impacted by the drug war, essentially, in different ways. They're now sort of starting to kind of be like, working with the fund is just too much of a headache. We kind of want to go about this and do this ourselves, find our own real estate, hire our own people, come up with our own creative plan, our own design firm, do this our own way, and the state is starting to kind of realize that might be a little bit of a better approach.
Is that the same fund that you were talking about earlier that you said they sort of kind of illegally selected a single brokerage firm?
Yeah, that's the same one.
So how did that all happen? I haven't heard that story at all.
Yeah. So basically, one of the board members of the Cannabis Control Board um, works very closely with the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York, or what we call DASNY here.
Mm-hmm.
And DASNY is kind of responsible for the development of schools, different state projects, basically. And they had already been working with this group, CBRE, who's maybe the largest real estate corporation in the world. Um, but instead of kind of doing a bid process, which they're required to do for large state contracts, I think maybe out of convenience, I want to say it was probably out of, convenience as opposed to some kind of like crony situation. They just sort of kept working with that group to start this new $200 million fund. And so that fund was tasked with leasing 150 locations around the state. Many of them would be in New York City. And the idea was that the state was going to lease all these spaces and then sublease them to the cannabis operators. And sort of instead of having the wider real estate brokerage community, we're not the only cannabis real estate. We're the only real estate firm that focuses entirely on cannabis, but there's other firms that have brokers there that do specialize in cannabis. But, so they kind of like cut off that whole world from kind of participating in that. Mm-hmm. CBRE was a company that officially didn't work with cannabis until the state sort of tasked them to do this.
Right.
So, this is kind of in some ways like an issue that's near and dear to us. Most people aren't that interested in how like a small real estate brokerage firm kind of got like screwed out of the industry
right.
by the state, but it does like kind of, I think show that it can be worrying, mm-hmm. That they would be so well intentioned, and then take such a strong step towards actually, promoting a large corporation at the expense of small businesses, right? Like you really, so yeah, that's sort of where we're at with that, and it's sort of to be seen now, if all these spaces that the state has rented are actually going to get occupied by these dispensary operators. A few of them have, and a few of them are open. I think maybe something like 4 now. Mm-hmm. But we are starting to see clients that are coming to us that are saying, we don't want to go to those spaces that have been pre-leased by the state.
Okay.
And pay 11% interest on the money that you're being loaned is also a big part of the conversation for a lot of these groups.
Right.
Well, it definitely sounds like you guys are, okay. It definitely sounds like you're navigating a lot of obstacles in the industry. So, I definitely applaud both of you for your staying power and resolve. And if there is any part of the industry or, this is the type of information that is vital to our listeners, vital to our viewers. So I thank you very much for joining us and sharing that part of the story because, these are pains that other people in the industry are going through as well. Before we get out of here, Daniel, I just wanted to ask you first, do you have any final thoughts before we get out of here, either about yourself or Cannabeta?
Yeah, I think Cannabeta is certainly the most experienced now within the tri-state area and beyond on being your cannabis real estate professional. Now that we've, had some of these growing pains and been gone through a lot of the nuts and bolts conversations, I think we certainly have a better understanding than going to your average broker who is going to get frustrated by all of these things we discussed in this podcast. So I think we certainly are going to be a great resource. Mm-hmm. And I certainly recommend, doing your research ahead of time on spaces and companies. And I would say that the best thing you can do is find yourself a great licensing specialist that is going to work closely with your real estate specialist.
Maddie, final thoughts.
Well, I don't know if I could have said it better than Daniel there, but obviously we're always happy to work with new groups personally, and excited to even though we're kind of like mentioning a lot of stuff about how the industry is hard and all this, and it has been a hard past couple of years for the industry, I think, at whole. I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm excited to see. We talked about sustainability a little bit during this show. I'm excited to see the industry hopefully kind of move towards more of a focus on sustainability on a personal level. And yeah, I think that also probably important to mention that if folks want to find us, they can go to our website, which is just cannabeta.com. So that's CANNABETA.com. And we're just really appreciative that you had us on your show. This was a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, no, I really enjoyed the insight. A lot of parts of the industry that I've never really discussed or uncovered. So thank you again for the time. But
you're welcome.
Before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter and make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. All right, for Daniel Kahn and Maddie Namer with Cannabeta, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.